Welcome to History from a New Perspective, a new history channel and podcast covering the history and historical stories from parts of the world which don't always get as much attention. My name is Joseph Keane, and today we'll be looking at the history of the Algerian War of Independence. In 1954, an armed conflict broke out between France and Algeria's National Liberation Front, eventually leading to the deaths of somewhere between 400,000 to 1.5 million people. The North African nation had been a colony of the European country since 1830. Now, this war was a key event in a series of global wars of decolonisation affecting European empires in the 20th century. Now, for more on this, I've been speaking to Natalya Benkhaled-Vince, historian of the French Empire, decolonisation and post-colonial histories at the University of Oxford. I first of all started by asking her how France initially wrestled control of Algeria.
Algeria is first invaded by France in 1830, but actually the conquest of Algeria goes on over the course of the 19th century. It actually takes a very long time to bring all of this territory under French control. And Algeria has a very particular status in the French Empire. So it's not actually a colony. It doesn't come under the authority of the Ministry for Colonies. It is from 1848 onwards considered an integral part of France, with three departments of Oran, Algiers and Constantine. And then later in the 1950s, actually, those departments are broken down again into smaller entities. So that means that in theory, the status of Algeria, or at least the northern regions of Algeria, are exactly the same as departments in metropolitan France. In practice, people living there are very much living in a colonial situation. So the other particularity of Algeria is that it's a settler colony. By the 1950s, for every one person who has sort of European status, there's about 8.5 people who are generally referred to as Muslims or sort of French of Muslim origin. And those people with European status, they have privileged voting rights, they largely dominate the economy, they dominate politics. And those that have Muslim personal status is sort of second-class citizenship, without the same level of voting rights, with special laws, kind of a native code that only applies to them, which makes a whole series of things about sort of political organisation and a whole set of crimes that are not actually crimes if you're European, are crimes if you're of Muslim personal status. The first thing to point out is that the Europeans of Algeria are not all French. Far from it. Many of them are coming from Spain, they're coming from Malta, they're coming from Germany. And from 1889 onwards, all of these people are sort of naturalised as French citizens as a way of the French seeking to sort of boost their presence in Algeria, sort of making sure basically that they have enough people to rule over the colonies. And then the other group of people who get put into this category of Europeans is the Jewish population of Algeria. Now, the Jewish presence in Algeria is a very, very ancient one. It goes back many, many, many centuries. And initially, the Jewish population of Algeria is treated in exactly the same way as the Muslim population of Algeria, in that they are sort of subject to indigenous status, with all sort of the second-class citizenship rights that come with that. And then in 1870, a law is passed, the Crémieux Decree, which gives Jewish people full French citizenship. And again, for the French state and the colonial authorities, that is a way of sort of strengthening the size of the European community in Algeria in relation to the indigenous population.
How important were the experiences of Algerian soldiers in the two world wars in the build-up to this, many of whom served in the French army?
So it's estimated that about 175,000 Algerian men serve in the French army during the First World War. And the French really debate whether or not to conscript soldiers from their colonies, both in North and West Africa, into the army, because they're very aware that by the late 19th century, a very clear connection has been made between military service and citizenship, i.e., if you accept being conscripted for a nation state, you are entitled to full citizenship of that nation state. And the French authorities are very conscious of this connection. They know that our Algerian nationalists, or sort of proto-nationalists that exist in this period, are also very conscious of this connection. And they're worried, really. They're worried about the political consequences of conscription. But in the end, the French need for men to fight overrides that political concern, and they recruit large numbers of men from Algeria, from North Africa, from West Africa as well. Now, if we then move forward to the Second World War, again, a slightly different situation here. And that's because, obviously, you know, metropolitan France is defeated in 6 weeks in May, June 1940. It's divided into two. And initially, at least, all of the colonies are attached to the Vichy regime, so the collaborationist Vichy regime in the south of France, in the southern part of France. And actually, some of the first administrators to turn against the Vichy regime are governors of the colonies. So initially, at least, Algeria is part of the Vichy regime. This is really significant because one of the things that the Vichy regime does is it strips the Jewish population of Algeria of their French citizenship. That is really significant in terms of the development of Algerian nationalism, because Algerians who are looking at this, who maybe in the 20s and 30s were demanding French citizenship, are thinking, well, hang on a minute, the Jewish population of Algeria had French citizenship. It was a right that they had. And then, you know, who was in power changed, the political regime changed, and it was taken off them. So citizenship starts to be understood. It's not an inalienable right. Okay. And so this is a really important lesson for sort of Muslim reformers who kind of wanted to work within the system, who wanted the extension of citizenship rights rather than the overthrow of the colonial regime, because they see what happens to the Jewish population of Algeria. And that is a very stark, wake-up call in many ways, actually, that it might not be enough to achieve equality and freedom just to have equal citizenship rights within the French Empire, that actually maybe it's the French Empire in and of itself that needs to end. So that's a really important moment. The other, really important moment as well is that, of course, North Africa is invaded, by the Allies' Operation Torch in November 1942. And this delivers a huge blow to, the image of France as this, sort of big, powerful state, because fundamentally, they've been overrun by the Americans. And then the final thing I would point out that's really significant in terms of the Second World War is the fact that the liberation of Europe, and in particular liberation of Italy and mainland France, comes from the colonies, so because they're not occupied. So you have large numbers of Algerians in Italy, you have large numbers of Algerians participating in the liberation of France. Some of those people go on to be quite key figures in the National Liberation Front.
So how do we go from those key moments up until the significant events of May 1945, which is a really important turning point, isn't it, before the start of the war in 1954?
Yeah, so on the 8th of May 1945, it's Victory in Europe Day, and populations across Algeria, both those with European status and those with sort of Muslim status, are celebrating this event. And in Sétif, there is which is a fairly small town in the east of Algeria. There is a demonstration. It's a Victory in Europe demonstration. But then some of the demonstrators start bringing out what is kind of a prototype, really, of sort of the Algerian flag. They start putting out chants in favour of the liberation of Moussali Hadj, who's a nationalist leader who's been put under house arrest. And they are connecting the liberation of Europe with the liberation of Algeria. And sort of a scuffle breaks out, a riot breaks out. There are 123 Europeans in Sétif who are killed, but then the repression against that is absolutely pitiless. It goes on for weeks and months, sort of across the whole region. The BBC estimates between 10 and 12,000 Algerians are killed during this period by French soldiers, but also by settlers, by Europeans who've sort of armed themselves, who are acting as kind of sort of militia units. So the repression, according to the BBC, is sort of 10 to 12,000. According to, Algerian nationalist parties, it's up to 45,000 people. And this is often seen as a really sort of important turning point, the idea that actually there is no scope for negotiation with the colonial system, because even when we sort of participate in sort of a peaceful demonstration, this is not a means that is going to get us listened to.
So the war has now begun. It's November 1954. Who are the sides involved in the fighting? And is it what we would call conventional warfare?
It's obviously not conventional warfare. The Algerian National Liberation Front, Algerian National Liberation Army, they are fighting, one of the biggest, best armed, best trained armies in the world. They're never going to, defeat them in conventional warfare. They don't have the weaponry. Or people who go on to be very important in the National Liberation Front, the FLN, have been thinking about how are we going to defeat, the French. And they understand that can only take place through a combination of military tactics and political tactics, and that the two are interrelated with each other. So you use violence to put political pressure on, but ultimately this is only ever going to come out through a political solution whereby either people in metropolitan France get sick of this war. There's too many soldiers being killed, there's too many bodies coming home, it's costing too much money, but also you discredit France on the international stage because of the way in which they are conducting this war. And that, again, is a way of applying leverage to persuade the French, basically, to withdraw. And you use international organisations such as the United Nations to do this. Now, the key thing to point out about the National Liberation Front, the FLN, is it's a really new organisation in 1954. It's only created in October 1954. They issue their declaration when they carry out their first series of sort of bomb attacks across the Algerian territory, and most people won't have sort of heard of them. But some of these people involved in the National Liberation Front are nevertheless sort of, fairly well-established figures within nationalist movements. The methods that they use to fight are things like initially sort of acts of sabotage, so targeting infrastructure, assassinations, initially sort of assassinating, figures of colonial authority, so gendarmes, police, but then later, they do assassinate civilians as well. Possibly the form of military action that most people will know most about will be sort of bombs in urban areas, because of course that's the subject of the film The Battle of Algiers by Gillo Pontecorvo, which came out in 1966. But then a lot of rural guerrillas as well. So, groups of mainly men, but also some women who are moving sort of quite rapidly across the Algerian territory.
So how do the French respond to this method of fighting employed by the FLN or National Liberation Front?
So as soon as sort of, the 1st of November attacks take place, there's a very clear message that is sent out by the French government that Algeria is France, Algeria is an integral part of France, and, these are the attacks basically of a handful of fanatics. Often Nasser in Egypt is sort of blamed as kind of fomenting this, as if this isn't something, indigenous to Algerian society, that they're terrorists, and that, very quickly we are going to bring Algeria under control. And actually, right up until 1999, in official terminology in France, the war in Algeria is described as a law and order operation. What we actually get is one of the biggest wars of the 20th century, where you get increasing numbers of troops sent to Algeria. You get conscription. All men of a certain age in France will have served in Algeria. And sort of in terms of the tactics that they use, very much actually borrowing from things that some of the most senior figures have learned in Indochina. Yeah. So how do you break down the solidarity, for example, between rural villages and, the FLN's sort of rural maquisards? Collective punishment. Yeah. So if a village is suspected of supporting the FLN, you round up all the villagers, you put all the men in prison, you burn all their food supplies. Mass sort of sweeps of gathering up, large numbers of people from, any given area and forcibly displacing them into camps. Sometimes the justification for that is given that we're protecting these people from the FLN. Sometimes it's more explicitly explained that we don't want them sort of supporting the FLN. So there is a level of violence that is extremely high level of violence sort of applied to try and bring this rebellion, as it's seen by the French, under control, that ultimately probably more serves the purpose of alienating vast numbers of the civilian population.
And how much of a key role do women play in this conflict?
So women are absolutely central to the National Liberation Front. So it is guerrilla warfare, and in any kind of guerrilla warfare, you are very, very dependent on the civilian population. So in both rural and urban areas, women are key in terms of hiding people, in terms of feeding combatants. Women and children are very useful in terms of sort of collecting information, but women also do have roles both in bomb networks, and again, some of the best known women are women who planted bombs as part of the urban bomb networks. And women are also, some women are also sort of nurses, and one woman's actually a doctor in sort of the rural guerrilla units as well.
So what are the factors which bring this conflict to an end? Is it to do with the campaigning in France, or is it more to do with events on the ground?
I mean, I think sort of the two are inseparable. So the sort of sapping away at the French will to remain through bomb attacks, both in Algeria and in metropolitan France, as well as all the political campaigning against the French army's use of torture, pushing back against this idea that France is sort of leading sort of a civilizing mission, and that kind of campaign is taking place both in France but also sort of internationally. The FLN has got sort of lobbies going on at the UN as well. So both of those things are interacting with each other, and they're sort of functioning in tandem to bring the war to the end. I mean, I think the key thing is that de Gaulle comes back to power in 1958. He's brought back by the Europeans, sort of the settlers, on a basis of keeping Algeria French. But then actually fairly quickly, I would say after about 2 years, he decides that this is actually overall going to be quite damaging to France's international image. So he has various attempts to extract France from the Algeria situation.
So is public opinion in metropolitan France in step with Algerians of European descent, or is there a divergence?
Not all, but nevertheless, the vast majority of Europeans of Algeria decide to migrate. The word return isn't really the right word, given them most of them weren't actually born in France, but the term used at the time is they are repatriated to France. When they're in Algeria for the 132 years, or periods of different length that this population is in Algeria, they're actually very diverse. So I mentioned earlier that some of the people with European civil status actually belong to the very, very old Jewish community in Algeria. For example, who would have been Arabic speaking. They're just as indigenous as the Muslim population. So this is a diverse population. political opinion ranges, from the far right. Some of the far right groups in France in the interwar period are particularly popular in Algeria, to the Communist Party. And from the late 1930s onwards, there's actually a particular effort on the part of the Communist Party in Algeria to include more Algerians in it, to include more indigenous people in it. And there's a number of people of European origin in the Communist Party who actually join the FLN, who fight on the side of independence as well. So we need to acknowledge both the political and the social diversity of this group of Europeans of Algeria. There's about 1 million of them in 1954. And at the same time, the fact that the vast majority of them do go to France after 1962. They do not want to live in an Algeria in which they are not going to have sort of privileged citizenship rights, in which their land is potentially going to be redistributed, and in which some of them, perhaps for very reasonable reasons, have concerns about their personal safety. So the last sort of few months of the conflict, and actually in particular between the ceasefire that's agreed between the French government and the leaders of the FLN in March 62 and the Declaration of Independence in July 62, is marked with, significant violence as a radical group of settlers that doesn't accept Algerian independence, the secret armed organisation, basically is operating, a series of assassinations of Algerians, burning down infrastructure. This is sort of a scorched earth policy. We're going to leave nothing behind.
And what about the legacy of this conflict? Algeria becomes independent in July 1962, but how is it remembered in the two countries until this day?
So if we start with Algeria, the War of Independence is the foundational event, really, in post-independence history, and particularly for the National Liberation Front, that, transitions from being a wartime front into being a post-war political party, and indeed a single party. This is basically the source of their legitimacy. So quite unsurprisingly, arguing about who was a real or a false veteran is a really important sort of political grammar. Lots of political debates take place through this language of true and false veterans, what really happened, and so on and so forth. What in Algeria people are perhaps less focused on is the use of violence by the French army. Everybody knows that it was incredibly violent, that torture was used as a weapon of war, that rape was commonplace, But those questions about torture and violence are much more important in a French context, because it really is about France's image of itself as a republic, as the country of the rights of man, and so on and so forth. And those torture debates sort of really re-emerged in France, with a vengeance, really, sort of from 2000 onwards. Other debates that are really important in France were about the 17th of October 1961, so when there was a peaceful demonstration that is brutally repressed by the French police. And they become really important because they become bound up in debates about police brutality towards second and third generation immigrants in France.
That was Natalya Benkhaled-Vince, historian of the French Empire, decolonisation and post-colonial histories at the University of Oxford, speaking to me there about the history of the Algerian War of Independence. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for joining us today on History from a New Perspective, and we'll see you in the next episode.